Hello, Dr. Amelia Villagomez. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, likewise. I'm excited to be able to share a huge passion of mine with the community here.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing because Brian and I, of course, did a really quick talk about just introducing this topic. And the reason why this topic is so important, and it's one of the passions that I have in regards to nutrition and mental health, is because we busted a myth. And what myth we busted on Monday was that medication can be a broad brushstroke answer to everything. And right. And so what he was able to clearly explain was that medication itself isn't going to be what creates anything new in the body, new neurotransmitters or any new something that the body doesn't already have. It's not going to give it. It's going to push around what you already have. And so it opens up into this broader conversation of when we talk about especially the mental health of our children and the well-being of our children, is that we're wanting to create, help foster resiliency and adaptability and also joy. And so when we're working with dysregulation of any kind, and I always say dysregulation can fall in the continuum of chaos and go on the other side of rigidity. But we're working to widen our window of tolerance so that when we face a challenge, we can move and adapt versus being overwhelmed, which can take us into hyper responsiveness, that sympathetic anxiety or agitation and anger. Or if the challenge is too big and we get overwhelmed, we can go into hypo-responsive, which is low moods, difficult to attend. And I think what we're seeing, and we've talked about before, is that, anxiety, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, right? We've got some of these topics on the table, and those won't be addressed today, because I think what we want to do today is lay the foundations or the building blocks and how integrative medicine works to address the building blocks of well-being.
I think what you just described a lot is talking about the vagus nerve. Yes. We know that you all probably have talked about this already, but a lot of that sort of hypo-responsiveness or hyper-responsiveness is mediated through the vagus nerve. And where does the vagus nerve go? It goes from our gut to our brain. So it's no surprise that what we eat and what our nutrition looks like is going to affect our ability to be resilient and to regulate ourselves.
Absolutely. So that's going to be where we go with that. And I'm excited for you to talk about micronutrients, because this is something that I address, Kids Braintree addresses, your practice addresses, Dabney Porter and her nutrition. We're always talking about how nutrition plays a role in helping support the, all of the functions of the body, that really that nutrition, as well as hydration, it's one of the fundamental building blocks. And so whenever you're ready, I am ready to enter the presentation.
Thank you. And I'll share that I have moved to Fort Worth over the past year, and I've had the blessing of joining Progressive Psychiatry, and we're grateful to have that connection with Kids Braintree. And I also teach what I'm sharing with you all to physicians through the University of Arizona. We have an integrated psychiatry program where we teach residents and fellows many approaches for integrative medicine. One of the things we really focus on is going to be today's topic of broad spectrum micronutrients, because we find it so helpful. A lot of times when we're prescribing supplements, we find some small benefit. But when I say that there's one of the things that I find that has a large benefit are these broad spectrum micronutrients. So that'll be the focus of today's talk.
Awesome.
Specifically, we'll start first with nutrition. And I often say to parents who come to see me, yes, we need to be able to address your child's nutrition. We know that it impacts mental health, and we have plenty of studies about that. I ask every kid how often they poop and what their poop looks like. Because that gives us an understanding of what's going on in the brain, how is the gut metabolizing things, and what's the body able to absorb. So just kind of thinking food-wise, they've done a study, many of them, this one looks at adolescents, 3,000 of them in Australia, and what they showed was generally, if you ate better, you felt better. Now, many people will say, well, when I feel well, I eat well. When I feel bad, I want the M&Ms and the popcorn and the fried food. And that is true also. However, the results of this had a stronger effect between what you ate first and then how you felt later. So I think that shows that loop goes both ways. So, we know that when you're not feeling well, one powerful intervention is exercise. And I'd say another powerful intervention is food. If you're not feeling well, yeah, you might not be craving the apple and the grapes and the carrots and all those sorts of things, but maybe that's what we can proactively reach for as a way to make ourselves feel a bit better. So if we know food is important about how we feel, how are we doing? And in general, I'd say bad. We call it the SAD diet, the standard American diet.
Mm-hmm.
We're having too many refined grains, too much sodium, too much saturated fat, and we're not getting enough calcium, vitamin D, fiber, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. I remember just a few months ago, I asked somebody how many fruits and vegetables they ate, and they said 1. I said, okay, 1 a day. She said, no, 1 a week. And I think that's becoming more and more the norm in the kids that we see. Now this graph really gives me pause, because often we think, okay, well, we live in America, we live in a country where food is plentiful, people are probably getting enough of what we need. And that's kind of the message that we hear, that yeah, maybe diets aren't perfect, but people are getting enough. Unfortunately, that's not true. If we look at this study here, it shows the percentage of the US population that did not meet the estimated average requirement for specific nutrients. And we see selenium, iron, phosphorus, copper, zinc, magnesium, calcium, and potassium were deficient. Now, a lot of these studies, you'll see different studies that say different amounts and different percentages that people are lacking. It depends on whether they're looking at food journals versus actually doing blood tests, how they're gathering the data. But to summarize it all, we're deficient.
Yeah.
We're not eating well and we're deficient. And part of that is because what we're eating, but another part of that is the decreased mineral content in vegetables and fruits over the past 50 years. So about the food, if we ate the same piece of broccoli today versus 50 years ago, it has about half the nutrients that it used to. And so I think that's really a place for pause, because not only are our children in general not eating as well, but what we are able to get into them doesn't have the same nutrient content. And we ask ourselves why. Well, 1, we're eating out of season. 2, storage and ripening systems have changed. Plant breeding, changes in soil. And also another thing that I think we're understanding more is the effect of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Yes.
Plants are taking in that carbon dioxide, and they're growing faster. And you might think, okay, that's a good thing. We're having bigger plants that are growing faster. And unfortunately, the data shows that because these plants are growing faster, they have a higher sugar content and a lower mineral content. So this is another reason that what's going on in our environment is really affecting everything, including the foods that we eat.
I think that's powerful. Like you said, the sugar goes up, right? And one thing that we're all working with our kids is to decrease the amount of sugar intake, especially our kids who have attention issues or in behavioral issues. So that's an important point right there.
For sure. And the micronutrient content, is decreasing. And when I first started studying integrative medicine, I looked at ADHD, because that's what we see a lot of in our kiddos. And what we know is that kids with ADHD have lower levels of zinc, vitamin D, magnesium, and omega-3s. We know that if you take blood levels and you give the same kid with ADHD and a kid without ADHD the same diet, the kid with ADHD is more likely to have lower values of those nutrients, even though they're eating the same food. And so what I had been taught is, okay, well, let's replete the magnesium. Let's give them a little bit of magnesium. Let's give them a little bit of iron. Let's give them a little bit of vitamin D. And let's give them a little bit of omega-3s. And what ended up happening is parents would come back and they get a little bit better. Not a lot, a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also true with depression and anxiety, is that when we gave one thing at a time, I saw some effect. I wouldn't say it was a measurable effect. And many families didn't want to, take all these different supplements. And so I think where my thinking shifted is the idea around broad spectrum micronutrients. Mm-hmm. So basically what that is there's a few companies that sell this, and I'm affiliated with no company. I make no money off of anything I talk about, and I think that's really important to say up front. my main intention is for kids to be healthier and families to be happier. And I tell all my patients, I'm not making any money off of anything I'm saying to you. And I think it's important that you know that, because I'm talking based on science. I'm not talking based on what I think is best for me financially.
Right.
So there's two companies at this time that make and have researched broad spectrum micronutrients. And so that's essentially using 30 vitamins and minerals to be able to treat. So rather than repleting one at a time, it's giving the body a whole bunch and assuming that it's going to figure out what it's deficient in and take it in, and what it's not, it's going to pee it out. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So this supplement, the two companies that sell this are called True Hope, and their product is called EM Power Plus, and the other is called Daily Essential Nutrients, made by Hardy Nutritionals. And I just give those names out because they're the ones that have actually had studies behind them. A lot of families will ask me, well, why not just take a multivitamin? And I say, probably because you're going to pee it out. Because what we know is what's important is how those minerals are chelated, how they're combined and how they're absorbed in the body. And you want to take something that's been tested, that's been actually looked at. And the FDA has looked at, both Health Canada, which is FDA equivalent in Canada, and the FDA here has looked at the quality and the source of these vitamins. And they had to do that because they've been looked at in studies. And so when you look at these things, nutraceuticals in studies, you have to get an IND and they have to pass through regulations. So these two companies have done so. If anybody knows of any other companies, feel free to let me know that. But these are the two companies that I know have had the most rigorous research. And the other thing I should say around conflict of interest, just like we talk about pharmaceutical companies and all the billions of dollars that are involved and how that affects our drug studies, the same thing is a concern around nutraceuticals, I think. And this company actually does not pay the researchers, does not pay for the studies. All the researchers have independently funded these studies, usually through grants and usually through lots of labors of love. To be able to give us these studies for doctors to have the confidence to be able to say, there is data to suggest this is helpful. And so the conflict of interest here is extremely low. The companies only provide the supplements free of charge to the researchers, but the researchers are funding their own studies. So this is one of those studies, and it's an open label study, which means the patient knows that they're taking the supplement, right? Many studies, the patient doesn't know that they're taking it, and so that typically is considered a higher quality study. So these companies have been around for about 30 years, and so the research has started to be kind of first looking at open label studies, and then, as you'll see in the subsequent slides, has progressed to what is considered today the gold standard, which is a randomized controlled trial. So this first study here looked at kids with ADHD, and 71% were observed to have at least a 30% decrease in the ADHD symptoms. And compared with baseline functioning, 80% were identified as being much improved or very much improved. And that's what I really want parents to say when they come back to see me, right? I don't want them to say, I think it might be working, doctor. What I want to hear is, wow, I know this is working and that we're making progress with what's going on. So recently, this is in 2017, there was a randomized control study. So the patients didn't know what they were getting and the researchers didn't know what they were getting. And so we have 46 on placebo, 47 on the micronutrients. It was 10 weeks long, and 47% were identified as having much or very much improved versus about 28% on placebo. And then what we know is what really improved is emotional regulation and aggression. And that's what I see in my patients too. Often kids with ADHD, their focus and attention often improve a lot with stimulants. And I'm a proponent of whatever works. So I often prescribe medications as well, because stimulants, they do help kids a lot. But often something that parents tell me in their follow-up is, but he's still moody. He still gets angry easily. It's better, but it's still there. Or some kids don't respond well to stimulants. We know about 80 to 90% of kids with ADHD do really well on stimulants. But about 10 to 20% can become more anxious or agitated on them. And to me, that often will point to a micronutrient deficiency. And so in this study, the effect size was a moderate effect size. So an effect size about 0.2 is a small effect size. An effect size of about 0.6 is a moderate effect size, and about 1 is a large effect size. And in this study, there were there were 2 dropouts, but between the placebo and the group getting the micronutrients, there weren't any differences in dropout. And the really nice thing is that there were no adverse events identified. And then the nice thing of this study is they looked at these same kids 1 year in follow-up. And that's huge because most pharmaceutical studies are done for 12 weeks. Yes, right. There are some that look, a year or 2 later, but that's rare. But this looked at 1 year follow-up, and those kids who were still on micronutrients did very well, and they continued to do well. Now, often, if something's placebo, maybe people find some benefit for a few weeks or a month, but it's rare that placebo is going to have a large effect over a year period. Those who stayed on micronutrients were more likely to have not done well with other treatments. That makes sense. And 80% of those taking micronutrients were considered to no longer have ADHD symptoms.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that you mentioned just here recently was that it's the safety factor of that, right? Because it's micronutrients. This is the safety that you have and trust you have in what you're taking. I mean, that speaks a lot to what micronutrients are and what they can do for the body.
Yes, I thought I had a slide on safety, but for some reason it's not here, but I want to talk about that. So, a lot of times we assume that if it's natural, it's safe.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily true. And so this actually has been tested and looked at with the micronutrients. And the data that we have is about a group of 150 adults and children who their blood work was looked at over a year period of time. And in these studies, they also look at the blood work. They also looked at the safety factors. And in general, yes, some kids can get some nausea, and some kids do have a little bit harder time tolerating it, and there's ways around that. But in general, the data that we have that's been published, and yes, we need more research, but the data that we have that's been published it gives us a lot of hope around safety and reassurance. And this is a conversation I have with parents all the time. There's the known and there's the unknown. For kids, we do not know the effect of medication on the developing brain. And I'd say the same thing with micronutrients. We don't have a conclusive picture, but we have to figure out with what we have right now. We do know that anxiety is unhealthy for the developing brain. We know, a kid to feel like they're lazy and stupid, that's really harmful to the developing brain. So we treat, and we constantly weigh the known risks with the unknown risks. Because the supplements, when you look at it, they are above the recommended daily allowance, but they are below the upper tolerable limit. So what does that mean? Well, the recommended daily allowance was based on healthy people. So what 95% of the population would be healthy with. Well, what about if you're not healthy? Then what number should you use? And that's one of the ask your doctor things, which physicians we have very little training in that.
Well, that's why it's important to have a relationship with someone like you, because that's going to be the key. You're not at your optimal, which is why you're seeking support in your well-being. And so with that, it's like you said, it's having these conversations, checking in, understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it is going to be, it's key for any therapy that you add. That relationship to your provider and your understanding of that is essential.
Absolutely. Because there's not one size fits all, right?
Right.
The exciting news is that there's another trial coming out with children, and we have preliminary results, and it looks very similar to the results that I just shared with you, but 2 studies. And there's also been a study in adults with ADHD showing very similar results. In my own experience, what it helps the most with is aggression and agitation and mood instability. Those kids who get angry easily, parents are walking on eggshells, and you see it over multiple different domains. You see it in school, you see it in home, it's kind of everywhere. I see those kids getting a lot better, and that's what the data really shows. We do use it outside of the kind of more researched things as well. And I see in general that when people are stressed, they're using more of their nutrients. They're going through those things faster. And so there has been data looking at, there was an earthquake in New Zealand, and that's where one of the researchers is. And they gave the people who were on the micronutrients during the research had less incidence of PTSD versus those who were not.
Wow.
So compelling data for, I think the highest level of data right now is for mood instability, but we're getting more and more data around low mood, anxiety, some with trauma. Obviously, trauma needs therapy, but micronutrients can really help support the body as well.
Right, because there's physiology with the trauma. It's that your body, that the stress response is staying on longer than it needs to be.
Right.
So if you have that right nutritional component to let your body process through that heightened state of alertness, of course, there's going to be absolutely some benefits to that. And like you were saying earlier, that agitation, we often talk about, we need a space to help someone reflect and be aware before they can make behavioral changes. But if a child's fuse is physiologically really short, we are going to be we're going to spend a lot of time and energy, right? Kind of like what I say, swimming upstream, to help with that reflection and awareness, because you have to have some space to do that. And so where that really spoke to me in terms of agitation, right? It's like we're working with that window of tolerance again, but from a nutritional and physiological perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a good way to say it, for sure. The other thing, I'll just kind of quickly go through this other data so there's time for questions. So in this study, and this was a small study, but it's interesting because it helps us understand mechanism of action. So they took a small group of 17 kids in the studies I just talked about, and they showed, and they looked at their microbiome, looked at their feces, and essentially what they saw is that there was an increased diversity of bacteria in their gut. And we know that increased diversity of bacteria is connected and associated with a stronger microbiome. So what we eat affects what bacteria live in our gut. So yeah, probiotics, we're still learning more about probiotics and what strain and how many, etc. But it's exciting for me to see that by giving micronutrients to the body, you're actually shifting the microbiome.
That's powerful.
So like any intervention, there can be adverse side effects. So I talk to families about that as well. In general, the biggest one that we talk about is that the gut has to be healthy before you give the micronutrients. If you give an unhealthy gut the micronutrients, it's not going to be as effective, and you can actually feel uncomfortable with nausea and diarrhea because the body's not absorbing the minerals, it's just going right through. So the first thing we talk about is how do we really optimize the gut. And if the gut's already optimized, then we can just go forward with micronutrients. But if a kid is craving a lot of sugar, they have kind of have been on a lot of antibiotics or steroids or have a really narrow diet, then we talk first about affecting the gut so that those healthy bacteria can be there and actually absorb the nutrients that we're going to be giving it. Otherwise, you can just feed the bad bacteria or the bacterial imbalance, and sometimes kids can feel worse on the supplement. So that's step one. And then the other thing that we talk to all families about is that the nutrients actually affect the level of medications in the body. Because what happens, like you described early on in the webinar, is that you're giving the body more of the building blocks. And you're actually slowing down the breakdown of medication in the body because the nutrients affect the cytochrome P450 system, which is what metabolizes medications. And so what often we'll have to do if a kiddo is on medicine is that we'll cross titrate. So we'll give them micronutrients, and then sometimes the kid can feel a bit agitated, and then we'll actually decrease the medications until we can find that sweet spot for the kiddos. In my experience, the micronutrients really help with and that's what the data shows, right? You see a lot of benefit for kids with emotional dysregulation who've had a diagnosis of ADHD. And what we'll often be able to do is to bring down the level of the dose of the medicine somewhere between where they're on a half or a quarter of where they were before, depending on what their starting dose was. And I do find that, the medications are helpful. There are some kids who who are just on the micronutrients and they do well, but I'd say most kids do end up with either other supplements or a small dose of medication or something else going on. So I want to always mention that, integrative medicine is really about bringing all the tools that we have, because they, stimulants are very effective for kids with ADHD. And so I talk to families about that too. Let's see, adverse effects we talked about. There's a great article in a conventional psychiatric literature, or in psychiatric literature. It's summarized here. I put that link there. There's also a terrific TED Talk by one of the researchers, Julia Ruckledge, who talks about why these micronutrients work and the importance of nutrition in mental health. And I just put the list of the 2 companies that sell it. They're on their website. You can see the 40 different studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals as well. And I will just say that if anybody's interested in micronutrients, I would suggest working with somebody who's familiar with them, because they are powerful interventions, and things that are powerful need some, it's ideal to work with somebody who has experience with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so this is amazing. And I want to kind of go back and just kind of highlight maybe a couple of things, because we have like 5 more minutes here. When we're talking about micronutrients, can you go back over kind of what kinds of things you see change in a child when they're responding well to micronutrients?
Yeah. So what I want to hear is from families, we're not walking on eggshells anymore. One family told me, I asked him to go put up the laundry, and usually that resulted in a meltdown. And he looked at me and he went to go put up the laundry. What I hear is that he's happier, or she just seems to have more energy. I see a lot with kids. The other thing I often see is those kids who have, that week before their menstrual cycles, they're really irritable, really agitated. Often they'll say, it wasn't so bad this month. It was good. Or not, maybe not good, but not as bad this month.
Right. It was different. And it didn't take you to such a dysregulated place, or whatever your dysregulation was in that, your pattern was.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the biggest thing I see is they're not as angry and they're happier. And the other thing is, for the micronutrients to really work, families have to be invested in it, because because there's so many nutrients in those pills, you can only get so much in one pill. And so the dose typically is anywhere between 4 to 12 per day. Okay. And earlier, these companies have been around for 30 years. And before, it was 32 capsules. So they brought it down, and they have a new formulation that actually comes in a kind of I call it the pixie stick. It kind of looks like a pixie stick, and you put it on your tongue and it's absorbed. That hasn't been studied in clinical research yet. It's from the same company. So we'll look for studies with that, because I think that'll really help the compliance, because it does require a kid and a parent to really want to make this work.
Consistency, I would think, would be important, because it's a nutraceutical. It sounds, I mean? It's like
right.
It is the medicine. And so you want to be consistent with it in order to see exactly how it's tolerated and what changes it makes in your child's system. When we talk about an unhealthy gut, what does an unhealthy gut look like? What would be the key indicators of an unhealthy gut?
So I have a little questionnaire that I give all the patients, and it kind of, in general, what we're looking for is, first, I'm wondering about offenders. So one common offender is antibiotics. So certainly antibiotics, if they're needed, and we can repair after, no problem. But if a kid has been on multiple antibiotics and they haven't maybe been on subsequent probiotics, or they've been on steroid pills, that can affect the tight junction. So basically, in our gut, we have little bitty gates between the cells in our gut cells, and different toxins, like medications, like stress, like not eating well enough, can open those channels so that the stuff that shouldn't get in the body gets in the body, and the thing that should get in the body has a harder time. People in lay terms call this leaky gut, but other increased intestinal permeability is kind of the more medical term. So that's one thing that we look for, is like, have there been offenders? Does this kid poop every day? Do they have complaints of nausea? Do they have a lot of gas? Do they feel bloated after they eat? Constipated? Narrow diet? And the other craving pasta, bread, carbs, because that's really what kind of the more unhealthy bacteria and candida or yeast function on. And, I talked with families about this is something that's has been not really researched in conventional psychiatry and conventional medicine. So this is kind of, we're going outside of the box a bit. But the reason why I talk about it is there was a case study where one of the participants in the ADHD trial had done really well on the micronutrients. And then she got a yeast infection. Then she was no longer responding to the micronutrients until she got the treatment of the yeast infection, and then she was able to get back to see her improvement again. And so, we have small bits of data and a lot of stories to try to help us put in the pieces. And so I talk to families that, we don't have a double-blind placebo-controlled trial to tell me exactly what does intestinal dysbiosis mean. What does a good gut versus an unhealthy gut mean? We have some questionnaires. We have probiotics to help with it. And we're going to do what we think is cheap, effective, and safe,
Yeah.
and we'll start from there. And then if that's not working, then we'll maybe have to try a different intervention. But unfortunately, most families don't have 20 years to wait for me to tell them exactly what probiotic with what strain and how many numbers. So we're gonna try with what the research that we have now is, and to go from there if they want. Right? Some families want this, some families don't want this, and I think that's where choice really comes into play, and informed consent. As a physician, I need to say the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives, and that's how we move forward.
Absolutely. And I love, just highlighting that part is that there's evidence-based and then there's research-informed. And this is very research-informed. And again, it's going based off of the personal relationship that you have with your client. And absolutely.
And most of what we do in child psychiatry is evidence-informed, even in the conventional practice, right? We borrow a lot of studies from adults and say, well, this works in adults, it should work in children. And I think that's one reason I became a child psychiatrist, in all honesty, is because I knew I wanted to practice integrated medicine. And I knew that I wanted to do it in a way that felt like I wasn't going to lose my medical license.
Right.
And I think that when the evidence that we have in child psychiatry, we do have a lot of evidence to support the use of the tools that we do have. But there's a lot of things that are done because we've heard it works, or in our experience it works, or this is kind of what the standard of care is in the community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, it is amazing to have started this discussion, because I think this is a doorway into several other discussions, in the future. And so a couple of questions. One, somebody had just kind of posted a question of, do you recommend a certain type of probiotics? Does eMpower, do they have their own that you recommend, or?
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of literature in this. So I haven't seen a single study for children for mood. We do have some studies on adults and mood. We know in healthy controls that probiotics may decrease fear responsiveness and improve mood. And there's just started to be studies done for adults with depression and anxiety. So what I typically tell families to do, one, if you can have more fermented foods, that's great. That's a great place to start. And if you can have more fiber, right? Because fiber is what the good bacteria are going to be growing with. Both companies do sell their own version of a pre and probiotic. It's combined into one. So sometimes we try that. I think that whenever you're looking for a probiotic, in general, you want one that has multiple strains. So if it just has one strain, I'm talking more about mental health, not so much about other indications, but mental health, you want to have multiple different strains, and then somewhere in the billions range, depending on how old the kid and what the symptoms are, anywhere between 1 and 20 billion, depending on what the symptom is. There is a nice guide, and I'm happy to send you the link so you can put it on the Facebook page, of all the studies that have been done with the various probiotics, and it'll tell you the indication, what supplement was actually used in that, and what the strains were. So depending on what the clinical picture looks like, I'll go back to that guide, or I'll recommend that we try something that's been third-party tested, right? Because that's the other concern about probiotics is does it really have the amount that it says on the bottle? And that's true for nutraceuticals in general. So we want to make sure that whatever product you are using has been third-party tested.
Because it goes back into how does the body absorb it? It can have I always look at it as that it can say it has this many million or billion, but does that follow through the whole digestive tract, through the digestion system, and through the gut? Can it retain that?
And really, probiotics is sort of like a bridge, right? Because ideally, I don't want my patient, ideally, somebody wouldn't have to take probiotics forever. Now, some people do, but ideally you wouldn't, right? You increase the fermented foods, you increase the fiber, you increase the water, and you decrease the stress. Because we know stress affects your microbiome too. And if you increase the nutrients, then you're going to have a healthier microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely. So last two things. Oh, this is amazing. So we have an amazing mom on here that she has her daughter on micronutrients. And she said that since being treated with that, her anxiety has just really diminished. It's amazing. I love reading these things. So, because I always get touched by that. And that there was a major difference in her daughter's anxiety and sad feelings after 3 days on Yeast Away. So it's one of the products that Ian Power has. But that's
and I think that's a testament to the mom as well. I just want to throw that out there because
100%.
It's not easy to do this sometimes, right?
No.
To get a kid to take something that they're not used to.
Right. And absolutely. And it also just shows it takes our tribe, and it takes people around you supporting the child and the family. And that's what we are both so fortunate. And I never am not grateful or don't feel honored, to walk. I mean, I always feel honored to walk alongside people on this journey. So, yeah. Well, Dr. Amelia Villagomez, that is an amazing topic that you just spoke about. And I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for your work. And can we say that, Dr. Amelia Villagomez, are you still taking new patients right now? Because I know I'm going to get that email saying I need to get in and see her. So, yeah.
Best I know, and best I understand, I have been at Progressive Psychiatry for a year, and so yes, still definitely have openings. And one of my goals for families is to always have an opening, so that because really I want to be fired within a year is what I tell parents. I want to come just a quick check-in.
Yes.
So that we're working really intensively in the first few months, but after that families know what they're doing, and that. Yeah. So to my knowledge, there are openings.
Yes.
At this point.
So that's great. Just to put it there. And then
there's an intake. If you go to Progressive Psychiatry, and you just fill out an intake and request to work with me because of the micronutrients, that's something that you all can do. Also, if you go to the websites for True Hope or the Daily Essential Nutrients, they'll have a list of people that have kind of physicians that have been trained with them, so that you can look to go to one of them. I'm not familiar if there's others here in the area, but I do know that in no way am I saying I'm the only one that knows this. There's a lot of good literature out there. And in general, it takes 10 years for the scientific literature to actually be transitioned to being seen in clinical practice. So a lot of people ask me, why have I never heard of this? And I say, well, it takes 10 years because right now there's a specific framework for how we think things have to be treated, right? If you talk, there's not the framework, there's not the culture to understanding it. So it requires a whole new education of physicians, and the data is increasing so that we're able to do that confidently, but it takes 10 years before things shift. And that data around 10 years is been published around medication use, So when there's a new medicine that comes out for a new indication, it takes 5 to 10 years, depending on what it is, for it to be seen regularly in clinical practice.
Absolutely, which is why I believe that research informed can bridge us there, because something's got to bridge us in between the time of the study and the 10 years following. So thank you so much. I appreciate everything. I appreciate your heart and everything that Progressive Psychiatry is doing, and we will talk soon. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to see you all. Thank you.